This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, welcoming you to our first Military History Night of the Fall 2014 season. On September 10th, RCMI member Patrick Murphy spoke to the gathering on the topic of Chocolate Soldiers, an Endangered Species, Australian militiamen clash with Japanese invaders in New Guinea.
Thank you, Pat. Let me start by saying how nice it is to be back once again on University Avenue at the RCMI for tonight's military history presentation, Chocolate Soldiers and Endangered Species. Java, March the 3rd, 1942. Seated in the cockpit of his DC-3, Captain Ivan Smirnov made ready for a hasty departure. Over the noise of the aircraft's Pratt and Whitney engines, he could hear the rumble of gunfire as it grew in intensity and malevolence. Good to go, he braced himself for the task in hand. He was now or never, take off or suffer the consequences. Behind him, the crew and 12 anxious refugees counted each minute as hope drained away. As the dark of night moved towards the dawn of day, Captain Smirnov looked earnestly for a courier bearing a parcel destined for delivery to a Melbourne bank. Spotting a man running towards the plane, he breathed a sigh of relief. Easing back on the controls, the captain delayed his departure just long enough to take possession of a brown paper parcel. With no time to waste, the captain tossed the parcel behind his seat and took off. Setting a course for mainland Australia, he crossed the Timor Sea and made for Broome, a refuelling base used by refugees fleeing the advancing Japanese. After 9 hours flying, Captain Smirnov reached Australia and through a cloud of dark, ominous smoke, caught sight of their intended destination under attack and burning. Within minutes of their arrival over Broome, 3-0 fighters swooped from above and with guns blazing strafed the DC-3. The sound of flying bullets and cannon shot came and went as the missiles punctured the fuselage, wounding pilot, crew and several passengers. With an engine on fire and blood flowing from his wounds, Captain Smirnov wrestled with the controls of his aircraft. Losing height, he tried to shake off the attacking Zeros, but their assault went on until the ailing aircraft crashed on the margin of Carnot Bay, 100 kilometres north of Broome. Dazed, bruised and bloody, the survivors emerged from the stricken aircraft and scattered as a hail of bullets chased them through the shallows. Only when the breathless survivors reached the beach did the Japanese planes break off their pursuit to head off and out to sea. After the fighters departed, the crew tended the wounded and from their wrecked aircraft sent off an SOS. Some of the wounded were in a pitiful state and bleeding badly. For them, there was little hope of, and surviving the crash was but a short-lived experience. First to go was a young mother, and after her, her baby, and 2 members of the flight crew. The sad ending of those who perished burdened the thoughts of those remaining. Having lived through the aerial attack and crash, would they make it through what was yet to come? Not knowing if or not their SOS had been picked up, the survivors took stock of their situation, and short of food and water, something had to be done. The wounded were in no shape to journey anywhere, and with only the fit and able to choose from, Captain Smirnov picked 4 to go for help. Taking their share of available food and water, those selected set off and into the wilderness. Before long, they were over the horizon and out of sight. Carrying the hopes of those left behind, they kept going when feet dragged and fatigue tasked their resolve. Succeed they must, or for them and the injured, time would run out. Back at the crash site, the able-bodied survivors did what they could to fill their day in a meaningful way, caring for the wounded, collecting shellfish and boiling sea water to produce droplets of drinkable water. When his duties allowed, Captain Smirnov searched the DC-3 for the brown paper parcel entrusted to his care. At the time of searching, there was no trace of the mystery parcel either on the aircraft or crash site nearby. Not knowing how soon help would arrive, the survivors waited in hope and lived with their doubts and hunger. The plight of the hacked survivors was not of their making. They were casualties of events which followed the collapse of colonial power in the Far East and America's decision to embark on a massive shipbuilding program aimed at creating a two-fleet navy for use on the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In the interim, the Pacific Fleet saw its numbers reduced to supply the Atlantic Fleet with the ships and crews needed for the protection of convoys running the gauntlet of troubled waters. The resulting power vacuum presented a resource-starved Japan with an opportunity it found hard to ignore or resist. Hit hard by the sanctions imposed on them after their 1940 invasion of French Indochina, they seized their chance. Looking to replace the status quo with their brand of empire, Japan embarked on a campaign of aggressive procurement that would beg a belief and affect the lives of millions throughout the Pacific. Following their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan set about clearing the board of all its opponents. Britain, France, Holland, and the United States buckled under the onslaught. Subduing the garrisons and outposts of imperial power, the triumphant Nipponese pushed forward until they stood on the threshold of continental Australia, Papua New Guinea. The Japanese plan of attack called for the bombing and shelling of Antipodean cities, followed by the isolation and partial occupation of the mainland. Containment and severance of supplies to Australia would effectively remove its threatened use as a base from which to launch an Allied counter-offensive. With the conquered territories of the Pacific to act as a buffer against reprisals, Japan was well placed to sit out the war behind its defensive shield. The cost of dislodging them, island by island, toehold by toehold, would be a butcher's bill beyond contemplation by all except those wedded to the sacrificial demands of Yakozai, to death, and the last man. Such being the case, Japan reasoned a war-weary alliance would come to terms before fighting battles of attrition across an area 3 times larger than Europe and the United States combined. Hope springs eternal, and for the survivors of the DC-3, the appearance of a friendly aircraft overhead was a sight for sore eyes. From the parched throats of a crew and stranded passengers came shouts of joy as from the belly of a Royal Australian Air Force plane came supplies and a message: relief party arriving from mission. In an instant, the nagging demons of doubt and privation were banished. With help on its way and rescue imminent, hope was rewarded and sleep came without forebodings. In the early hours of March 9, Captain Smirnov awoke, and to his great relief and joy, the first thing he saw was the smiling face of Bernie George bending over him. "You like a nice pot of tea?" The captain's response was not a matter of record, but it's hard to believe it could be other than a croaky affirmative. It was thanks to Bernie George, a local aborigine, that the mission at Beagle Bay was quick to hear of the crashed DC-3. Soon after, a rescue party led by Bernie reached the crash site and prepared the survivors for a 45-kilometre journey through sand dunes and mango scrub to a stock camp at Bunda Bunda. There, mounted on mules, they rode to the mission where, waiting to greet them, were the 4 sent from Carnot Bay to get help. Having landed in Australia, were the survivors beyond the reach of the harrying Japanese? Not really. 2 weeks prior to the shooting down of their flight, Darwin, was bombed and strafed by carrier-borne aircraft. Behind them, the raiders left a trail of death and devastation never before witnessed in Australia. Japanese raids on the Northern Territory demonstrated just how exposed the territories were to aerial attack back in 1942. Survivors were, for the moment, safe. But for how long? Would they too be obliged to join the exodus from the city? Japanese landings on Papua New Guinea brought with it the fear of a full-scale invasion of mainland Australia, and should that happen, cities were not the place to be, and for some, hiding in the outback seemed the best option. For all concerned, what seemed like a far and distant war was now anything but. Defence plans for Australia hinged on the Singapore option, which meant a dependence on the fortress island and a strong naval presence to act as a deterrent against would-be expansionist belligerents. Reliance on Britain's ability to underpin the defence of Australia was, as events proved, misguided. To the threatened invasion of Britain imposed limits on the universal presence of the Royal Navy, and its plans for the defence of empire were found wanting when tested by the pressing realities of global conflict. Deficiencies beyond remedy, compounded by outdated response strategies, triggered aggression and hastened the collapse of colonial governance. From the start of World War II, Australian imperial forces fought in North Africa, Singapore and elsewhere. The absence of the AIF overseas left the defence of Australia to a handful of untrained, ill-equipped and inexperienced militiamen, the so-called Chocos. The Australian Imperial Forces coined the name Chocos to define the difference between servicemen exposed to battle near and far and the stay-at-home melt-in-the-sun militia. Adding insult to injury, the militiamen were likened to at-risk protected species koalas. Yet to earn their spurs, the 10-foot militia were to prove their mettle when pitted against seasoned warriors of Japan. Win or lose, they were committed to engage the enemy. Tuesday, July the 21st, 1942. Burma, Papua New Guinea, the first of 14,430 troops of the Japanese South Seas Detachment landed on the north end of the Kokoda Trail. Under the command of Tomitaro Hori, the troops headed south along the trail. Issued with 10 days' ration, they were ordered to cross over the Owen Stanley Mountains and from the landward side attack Port Moresby. Considering the harsh terrain involved, even for an army used to fending for itself, such a meagre issue was to prove a serious miscalculation. To make matters worse, a combined naval, air and land attack on Port Moresby had to be deferred because air cover for the attack was no longer available following the epic battle of the Coral Sea. Whilst the battle range aircraft, the American Pacific Fleet sent the Japanese carrier Shokpo to the bottom of the Coral Sea. In the same battle, the Japanese carrier Shokaku was so badly damaged it had to return to Japan for urgent repairs. The carrier Zikaku made its way back to Japan because it needed to replace aircraft lost in action. The departure of two carriers and the sinking of another was a serious blow for the Japanese Imperial Navy and its plans for the capture of Port Moresby. For the troops committed to the journey over the Owen Stanley Mountains and the assault on the New Guinea capital, such a change of circumstance was to have a knock-on effect. Without air cover, the South Sea Detachment were alone and at the end of an extended supply line. And they not advance towards their objective would distance them from ready access to essential food and ammunition. Though no stranger to hardship, the Japanese detachment was to have a test in time, fighting their way along the Kokoda Trail. Between them and success stood the chocolate soldiers, The Japanese were odds-on favourites to triumph, but their progress along the undulating meandering trail was beset with problems. The Kokoda trail was a friend to no one, and heeded not the travail of men setting foot in its domain. Those so minded would pay dearly for their trespass. The inhospitable terrain exacted such punishment on those brought together by conflict that the sum of human misery was only exceeded by the ferocity of battle's fall. Fever-racked, they stood their ground, and in sodden jungle endured the endless torments of pestilence and hardship. With no quarter asked for, they spared not them who spared not anyone. Without mercy, theirs was a fight to the finish. The militiaman's lack of training and tender age was not a handicap, as events were to prove. Learning on the job, they grew in strength and experience. Duty and self-preservation changed them into formidable adversaries and soldiers at least equal to their Japanese opponents. Of course, lessons learned came at a price, and when the two sides clashed, both found the going tough. Kokoda Matsuga fought the Japanese in New Guinea from January 1943 until the end of World War II. Although recall the great brutality of the campaign, in which many soldiers committed suicide, the months of marching in unrelenting climate remains his most vivid memory of a time when it rained for more half a year straight. Our guns rusted. Iron just rotted away. Wounds wouldn't heal. Marching in rain was horrible. Drops fell from my cap into my mouth, mixing with my sweat. You slipped and fell, got up, went sprawling, stood up like an army of marching mud dolls. It went on without end, just trudging the muddy water, following the legs of someone in front of you. And from another veteran, it rains all year, and then the monsoon starts. The Kokoda Trail exists only because nature yields to the passage of native feet and constant usage. Stretching from the north coast swamps of Papua New Guinea, the trail snakes south and around the townships of Boona and Gona, and from there onwards to the capital, Port Moresby. Through jungle and over razorback ridges, it traverses the mountains, dividing the country east from west. From peaks of 2,000 metres and more, rock buttresses slope to form deep valley ravines, hosting primeval forest and abundant jungle growth. Sheltering under the leafy canopy of hardwood trees and burgeoning plant life, creatures of the jungle dwelt and prospered in the tropical damp and fetid atmosphere. In 1942, the sparsely populated village of Kokoda had few claims to fame and boasted of little other than a usable airstrip and rubber plantation. Halfway along the track to Port Moresby and situated in a wide and beautiful valley, some 400 metres above sea level, the village lies close to the swiftly flowing waters of the Mabari River. The village gave its name to the river track, soon to witness the life and death struggles of men pushed to the limits of endurance and beyond the realms of the possible. Malaria, scrub typhus, dengue fever, dysentery, wounds, infections, malnutrition and exhaustion were constant companions and harbingers of worse to follow. Disease-carrying insects were everywhere, as bees to honey. Multitude of black flies visited misery on the hungry as they downed food and defended their meal. Adding to their torment, sleep-stealing mosquitoes on duty 24/7. With them came parasites and chiggers to sap the vigour of troops, wending their way through the morass of foul-smelling mud and the waters of dubious content. The jungle fighters, be they from the empire on which the sun never set, or that of the rising sun, theirs was not a happy lot. Captain Smirnov returned to the crash site at Carnot Bay, accompanied by a relief party sent to recover mailbags from the DC-3. When there, he searched again for the mystery packages, but found nothing. Later he heard the lost package contained the finest of the very best cut diamonds, large and small. The estimated value was set at 300,000 UK pounds, a fortune then, and no less so at today's prices. Jack Palmer struck lucky the day he sailed into Kokoda Bay. Leaving his battered lugger swinging on its anchor, the Duggan Hunter went ashore to investigate the wreckage of the DC-3. Working his way through the fuselage, he came across a brown paper parcel wedged behind the seat. Curious to see what might be in the parcel, he opened it and removed a leather pouch. Emptying the contents of the pouch into the soup plate, he was stunned by what he saw. Before him, on his plate, a pile of white, sparkling diamonds. He could hardly believe his eyes until he gathered up a handful of the precious stones and let them trickle through his fingers. He was not imagining things, he was filthy rich. Of course, a secret is a secret no longer once shared with others. Unable to keep the news of his good fortune to himself, Palmer told two old beachers in Pender Bay and in good faith offered them a share of his newly acquired wealth. His companions each helped themselves to a spoon of diamonds, and whilst doing so, dropped several into the soft sand below their feet. After the share out, the Duggan Hunter and the beachcombers fell out. Following the upset, Palmer, in a fit of pique, joined the army. After handing the diamonds to the recruiting officer, he told his story to the military and went on to explain the diamonds handed over all that remained after some were lost in the sea. The army rounded up both the beachcombers for questioning, but not before one of them found time to bury a box containing 60 or more of the diamonds. Finding the box in the ashes of a coal campfire, two Aborigines took and traded 11 of the white stones for a tin of tobacco. The white stones were not the last of the diamonds to be dug from the soil, or indeed the last to surface. Over time, diamonds were traced and recovered from all parts of northern Australia. From missions, trading posts and places various, diamonds were collected and in due course returned to their rightful owners. In all, the army collected over 6,500 diamonds, worth at the time something in excess of 21,000 UK pounds. Missing and yet to be returned, diamonds valued at over $10 million. The Duggan Hunter and the beachcombers were arrested, tried for stealing, and released for lack of evidence. While the Australians and the Japanese fought for the control of the Kokoda Trail, the natives of Papua New Guinea found themselves pressed into service as stretcher bearers or fetch and carry porters. Born to the climate and terrain, the barefooted, sure-footed natives were used extensively throughout the campaign. Apart from allied airdrops of ammunition and supplies, everything else had to be carried along the track. As and when required, both sides relied on villagers to supply carriers to convey essentials when needed. Known to the Australians as angels, the native carriers worked miracles for the sick and wounded. They stretched from the field of battle for rest, repair and recovery. On their shoulders, the sick and injured were snatched from the misery of captured souls and spared the fate of those left behind. With the advantage of numbers and troops who feared shame more than death, the Japanese military employed the tried and tested tactics of engage, envelop and eliminate. Without regard for losses incurred, their forces moved ahead until encountering opposition. As soon as contact was made, they would attack, outflank and encircle opponents. Once the enemy was surrounded and subject to fire from all quarters, the Japanese would close in for the kill. Alone, outnumbered and thin on the ground, the militia were obliged to use delaying tactics to stave off defeat and military disaster. To hinder and frustrate the Japanese, they organised skirmish and ambush squads. Hitting hard the enemy and disengaging before being outflanked, the squads would, each in turn, moved back along the track and through the next staged ambush awaiting the enemy. Once safely through, they would proceed to the next suitable ambush site and there make ready to greet friends and deal with hostiles. These tactics were to deny the Japanese the victory they sought. Japanese failure to capture Port Moresby brought with it a hunger that was to turn the South Sea Detachment into desperate scavengers. Instead of dining at the table of the vanquished, the starving Japanese took to eating everything and anything needed to survive. Theirs was a savage hunger that knew no limits. Captured enemy rations, heaven sent by parachute, were manna indeed. Abundant caches of tinned food left open and exposed to climate and hasty decay was something else. The inevitable, debilitating consequences followed on the heels of gratification and reckless consumption. Suffering and sacrifice was not the key to victory. Although the Japanese came close to reaching Port Moresby, their military muscle was by then at full stretch. As one by one the fingers of Japan were prized off their acquisitions, dreams of empire faded. The South Sea Division was seasoned troops and well accustomed to jungle fighting. With so many conquests behind them, their commander, General Horry, was confident that taking of Port Moresby was all but a foregone conclusion. The campaign for the conquest of New Guinea counted on success and made no allowance for failure. Having defeated all opposition encountered, the Japanese military grew accustomed to winning. Self-delusion being endemic, invincibility was automatically assumed. For Japan, the Enlightenment began when they set foot on the Kokoda Trail. Ahead lay a journey en route to defeat. Like bronze gods, the desert veterans of the Australian Imperial Forces arrived to relieve the gaunt remnants of the gallant Chocos. With no time to spare, the relief troops made ready to defend the position held by the militia against fearsome odds. Undermanned and overstretched, the militia had repelled one attack after another until reduced numbers made a last stand the only option. Come what may, the 39th had to hold on until relieved. Saved from extinction by the timely arrival of the troops of the AAF, the children of lesser gods, though free to go, were loath to leave jungle fighting to others. Remaining behind, the militiamen and the AIF stood shoulder to shoulder and together defied 4 battalions of Japanese troops intent on eliminating all obstacles blocking the assault on Port Moresby. The battle that followed was not the last fought on Australian soil, but from then on the militia ceased to be the only troops standing in the way of the invaders. Having traded territory for time, they stalled the momentum of conquest and broke the spell of Japanese invincibility. Before tasting victory, a bitter pill to swallow. Battles are not won by retreats, and so it might seem to those charged with the planning of strategy. Far from the whiff of grape shot and the din of battle, the reality of conflict is less a shared experience and more a speculative exercise. Fueled by expectation, results may be disappoint, and when the unforeseen influences outcome, questions arise and answers are required. The rhetoric of discord leaves its mark when ivory tower generals lose respect and leadership is found wanting. Hearts and minds are not won by callous treatment. Having lived through hardship and battles fought along the Kokoda Trail, what was left of the 39th Battalion struggled back to Port Moresby. Instead of the expected recognition of their accomplishments, the battered militia were upbraided by their high command. Treated as losers, they were told, in future there will be no further retirements, but advance at all costs. To be addressed in such a manner was humiliating for the men of the militia who had fought with such valour to defend their country. With courage unrewarded and honour besmirched, the men listened and suffered in silence to their commander. His utterances were unwarranted and out of touch with reality. Within earshot of Allied aircraft takeoff and landings at Port Moresby, the attacking Japanese were poised to take the capital. However, with victory so tantalizingly close, the Japanese South Detachment were a spent force. Their meagre rations issued exhausted, and their wounded weighing them down. General Hori, his gamble had failed. There being no word for retreat in the Japanese military lexicon, he issued an order to advance to the rear. For Japanese troops, such an order was hard to obey, but follow it they did. For the general, the war had not gone as planned, and with the Allied forces growing in strength, the future looked decidedly bleak. The attack on Port Moresby had to be abandoned. The Australians harried the retreating Japanese and pushed them back along the track to where the Knights of Ishida set off on the path of misery. Leaving behind them the milestones of fruitless endeavour, the South Sea Detachment troops retired to prepare positions and made ready to end their lives in a manner of their choosing. Written off by Tokyo, they were abandoned. Like most of his men, the retreating general did not live to see the end of the New Guinea campaign. His war ended abruptly when he perished in the swollen waters of the river Kumusi. With the tide turning in favour of the Allies, Australian forces regrouped and made ready for battles ahead. The 39th Militia Battalion was amongst those affected. Removed from the order of battle on July the 3rd, 1943, the battalion ceased to be. As a measure of the militia's contribution and sacrifice, over its 18 months' existence, the battalion saw its numbers shrink from about 550 to a platoon strength of 32. Let the record speak for itself. The boy soldiers, the boy soldier militia, having passed through their tenderfoot teens, were now seasoned veterans and the proud survivors of a once endangered species. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Would you like to take a few questions?
Yes, sure. Tony, yes.
Patrick, why did the Australian High Command collapse the 39th Battalion? Why did they strike it off the order of battle?
Yeah, amongst them, they were the Papua New Guinea police were also involved, as was the 53rd Battalion, the militia, and they were just youngsters, and they just went straight enough. Some of them had not even fired a gun. If I'm allowed to say gun, it should be rifle, I know, but there you go. If they never pulled the trigger, they'd never seen active combat, yet they were pushed into the neck of this battle, and they were expected to hold it because there wasn't anybody else. You know, talk about scraping the barrel. They were. That's it. You know, but they went there and they found, for instance, that the situation was different insofar as you couldn't spread off the track because you were straight away within a few yards, 50 yards or so. You were in dense jungle. And there was occasions when patrols of opposite sides would meet up together. They'd bump into each other, literally, before they would actually start exchanging fire, because you couldn't see that much ahead of you. The light was, depending on the density of the canopy, was down to nil, the visibility, you know. So, did I answer your question, Tony?
Not really.
Well, could you come again?
I thought, you know, what it sounds like is that they thought that the battalion didn't do its job.
All right, okay.
And they were, you know, they failed. And
Yes. That's it. I understand, Tony. Sorry about that. I do. Thanks for the clarification. Yes, no, they hadn't. There was a number that were engaged, and their officers were disposed of by the Japanese, and so they were on their own. And these young guys were wandering around the jungle, bewildered, and they met some of the reinforcements coming up the trail, and a dim view was taken of their action that they left. But of course, you know, you just got to make allowance for the fact these were not properly trained troops, but it was all that Australia could throw at what was coming down through the Kokoda trail. Does that get nearer to it?
Much nearer, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. This is the barrel, isn't it?
Yes, the reason
from
the
Australia,
soldiers were fighting to protect Australia was that all the trained soldiers were fighting in Europe.
That's right. That's right.
And it was only when Chifley came to power that he said, we're bringing our soldiers back.
No.
So what these chocolate soldiers did really was tremendously appreciated by the Australian people.
Yeah, the AIF, you know, like all the Commonwealth or empires are probably known then, they all volunteered to do their bit. And of course, they thought, for instance, that the war was going to be fought in Europe, and they hadn't made allowances. In fact, the British had seriously underestimated the capabilities of the Japanese, and of course the Japanese made use of the vacuum created by the preoccupation with spite for our existence back in Great Britain. So, but the AIF was, they were out in, as I said, you know, in Europe, and they were also in the Far East. But there was nobody, it's almost true to say there was nobody available to staunch the flow, put their finger in the dike, because they were otherwise engaged. And then the war was envisaged, it was going to be fought in Europe, but it transpired it was going to become something different. And so that's, thank you very much. Cheers. Yes, sir. The name, please?
Bill McFarland. Is it true that when military historians started studying the campaign, it became aware of the general public and the government just what a miracle these guys had achieved, and they started to get the recognition they deserved, only it was 50 years after the war?
Yeah, they, and I have to say this, that they didn't have the best of publicity machine. The commander, General MacArthur, being American, he was very much a publicist. He had ambitions to become president, etc., etc. So it was a presentation that it was going forward, and the Australians did not get the due recognition for what they did. But that subsequently, there's been a number of books written about it since, and it's brought it to the public's attention. And why not? It's well deserved. Yes, Tony.
When they brought back the Australians from North Africa, they'd been there probably for 2 years, maybe even 3 years. How did they fare in the jungles of Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, before that they did...
they were in the desert before that.
Yeah, they came out of the desert, and then they had some jungle training, and they were equipped with camouflage uniforms. The guys, the militia had only khaki, and whereas the AIF, when they came back, they were put through jungle training, and they were then brought to New Guinea to relieve the militia and put up the resistance needed to defeat the Japanese. Even then it took them some time, but that's what happened to them. They came back from the deserts, and they had this training. But of course they were no strangers to battles. It was just a different format. They had to follow jungle and as opposed to open terrain, and that made a difference. But they quickly acclimatized, and they had the experts when they arrived, because the chocolate soldiers could put them in on. Because it wasn't just a question of you had a line, you defended a line. You had your foxhole, for the use of the term, and that had to be an all-round defensive, because the Japanese were skilled jungle fighters, and they would come through the foliage, and you wouldn't turn your back anywhere. You're back to back, and you'd be looking around all the time. It was constant, and they'd call out names, and they'd use English phrases which might, try and get people, keep them away, make them tired, so that And then these guys would just come in, they'd jump in your pit with you and do what they had to do. And of course they weren't too worried about dying because they were going to a better life, they think. I don't know. So that's what happened to the AI when they came back from what they didn't go straight into jungle fight. The other side? Yes.
At what point did the Gurkhas participate in the jungle warfare?
They were more, I think, they'd be more in Kohima, places like that, in Burma. There were. As far as I'm aware, there's no Gurkhas involved in defence of Australia.
This concludes today's webcast. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening. You can keep up with coming events at the RCMI by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. We hope you'll tune in again, and we hope to see you in person at coming events. Thank you and goodbye.